Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Michelle Thornton. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Business. I'm here today with several of my colleagues from the Human Subjects Committee. We've got Andrea Vickery, as well as Chairteo Rhodes and Laura Spenceley. And we're going to be sharing just some updates with you from the committee, as well as some tips that we have pulled together, a few new resources that we'd like to share with you to try and kind of give you a sense of what the Human Subjects Committee has been up to over the last year or so. So to get that started, I think what we'd really like to do is introduce you to our new chair, Chairteo Rhodes, who's going to kind of give you a little bit of insight about his philosophy on the committee and kind of what we've been doing.
Hi, I'm Chairteo Rhodes. I took over chair duties from the interim chair, who is Michelle Thornton, just last semester. And one of the big changes that led to all of this is that HSC was reorganized under ORSP to ensure that we had compliance with and steady sort of direction with the new regulations that have been coming out. As a result of that, we had a number of new members join HSC. We want to make sure we had a new chair, and it's been the committee is honestly great. It's a really great group of people who are really dedicated to making sure that faculty are able to get research done. I think almost all of us, as I think with most of the faculty here, come from R1 situations and have dealt with HSCs in various places under all kinds of things. And so there's a huge variety of experience, and it's a really great, a great committee whose interest is really getting research done and getting research facilitated. But making sure that human subjects are protected, and that's really our job. So it's just been it's again, I can't say great enough because there's a great group of people, and we really do try to treat people's protocol submissions the way we would want our protocol submissions treated. So yeah, we're here to help. Anytime you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or SP, because it'll get forwarded to me, and I'll try to get back to you as quick as possible.
Great. Thanks so much, Chairteo. I think that as committee, what we've realized is that sort of the biggest barrier to protecting human subjects is really making sure that all of us that are doing this work understand the concept of risk. And this is covered pretty excessively in the training that's required of anybody that does human subjects research on campus. But I think it always makes sense to just try and review that a little bit, constantly kind of bring ourselves back to this concept to understand really why a committee like ours has to exist, right? So essentially, when we ask you to tell us about your research in the protocol forms and in the consent statements that you provide us, what we're really asking you to do is help us understand what risks exist in your research. And to do that, you really are going to have to describe what those are, even if they're pretty minimal. And that needs to explain to us both how the research procedures itself pose a risk to participants, but kind of that companion piece is what you're doing as the investigator in the study to minimize them. Beyond that, you have to make the argument for why your research and the benefits that will come from it outweigh the risk taking. So that's really kind of the crux of what makes the research that we do worthwhile. We can't just acknowledge that we're putting subjects at risk if we don't anticipate or suspect that there's something important to be learned from or to be developed from the research that we're doing. Beyond that, if the risks are somehow more than minimal, we have to talk about why that's necessary. There's certainly some types of research where this is the case, and we recognize that. Certainly those studies are going to deserve more scrutiny by our committee, and there's additional precautions that need to be taken. But what we as a whole are attempting to do is make sure that we have a full scope and understanding of what those risks are, and that you're showcasing to us that you understand what they are, and are doing everything that you can to address them and sort of plan for the contingencies that could occur should something go wrong in your study. So I always like to kind of point out some pitfalls or the things that start to issue like question marks in our head. And these are things that after a couple of years of looking at protocols that we see common sort of issues over and over again that immediately cause us to say like, oh, shoot, we're going to need more information. So we wind up with several protocols that get submitted that say things like there's no risks at all, or there are just a vague description saying like there's only minimal risks, but not telling us what they are specifically. As a general rule, we feel that in most research, there is always going to be some kind of risk, even if it's something as small as somebody learning that you're participating in a research study, or regardless of how much effort we take as researchers to try and protect the information or data that we collect, there is the risk of that data being breached or somehow hacked into. So these are the different kinds of things that we have to at least acknowledge. So just saying something general doesn't show us that you've really sort of thought through those possibilities. The risks, another kind of common issue is the risks being inconsistently described between the protocol form where you're describing your research for us and the consent form, which is where you describe it to your participants. These two areas need to really align so that you're telling us the same thing that you're telling participants. And it's really important that if you describe a risk in the protocol, that you're also describing that for your participants in the consent form. And then finally, we do see sometimes risks being acknowledged, but then there's not kind of that second companion piece where you're talking about what you're doing to attempt to mitigate that or lessen that risk. So for example, I gave you the idea that it's possible that your data could be breached, right? So talking through what you've done to protect that, keeping it in a password protected file. If it's papers, keeping them under lock and key, right? So the idea is that we know there's a risk, and then what are we doing about it? So it's our job to kind of try and help you think about what types of risks there could be. And to me, we think about them in three basic categories. The first two are really related to each other, but we think about privacy and confidentiality, and there are differences, right? So invasion of privacy is essentially you have a subject that's participating in your research, and you're asking them some type of question or asking them to reveal information that is in some way sensitive or private, right? And just by asking them to reveal that, they are putting them in something of a vulnerable position where they are having to share something that maybe they wouldn't just normally in casual conversation. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing, this breach of confidentiality is then that information that they're giving to you under the assumption that you're not going to share that with anybody, that information gets out, that becomes known either by acknowledging the person's name or in some way identifying who they are in that information that was shared with you. This could be certainly something that was said in an interview or in a survey, but it also, I think about this a lot for me. I do research using health records, and that definitely, when we think about confidentiality, is a really critical issue. And then the final category is related to the study procedures themselves. And so here's, you want to think about the actual participation causes some kind of harm to the participant. And I think that many of us can think about this first bullet point. Physical harm is really straightforward. And if you're doing, survey or interview research, you can probably generally check the box that you don't anticipate that folks are going to be physically harmed by participating. Others of us are going to be doing research that's a little bit more experimental in nature or in person in some way. That could somehow create a physical harm. Even in terms of a COVID setting, we could think about physical harms if we're not taking appropriate precautions, right? But harm doesn't end with physical, and we need to remember and recognize that there are other ways that participants could be harmed as well. whether it's social, emotional, economic, or legal, these are all kind of areas that we should sort of check through as we're thinking about the risks involved in our study. I do research a lot in addition to in healthcare. I do it oftentimes in an employer-based setting. And so you can imagine a situation where, let's say, a participant was revealing something about their employer. Maybe it's about the benefits that they receive, something that they are less than thrilled with about that relationship. And they could certainly be concerned that that information could get back to their boss or their employer, resulting in some sort of impact to their career or their professional life that could equal a financial consequence. So while doing a survey doesn't automatically, kind of trigger that somebody could have a financial consequences, downstream there could be, should I not take appropriate precautions involved in designing my study. So we like to think about our studies about whether or not they pose a minimal risk or not more than minimal risk, rather, as opposed to higher risk. So it's kind of like a dividing line that you want to think about. And if studies don't pose more than minimal risk, they're going to be reviewed slightly differently than those that are greater than that, right? And so I guess for me, when I think about minimal risk, I think that we recognize that as we move through the world, all of us encounter risks. And whether that is if I'm banking online or I'm sharing information on Facebook, like there's all kinds of things I do in my daily life that could pose some risks to me. So the idea of minimal risk is that by me participating in this study, the probability that I am not exposing myself to anything greater than those things that would happen in my daily life means that the study itself doesn't pose more than kind of that normal or minimal risk that's out there. Now, even minimal risks, however, are ones that have to be described, right? We still have to recognize that they exist. But this sort of defining line is what causes us as this Human Subjects Committee to look at things slightly differently. So we have categories of review, and that's all tied back to this issue of risk. And depending on the level of risk, we take different pathways in how we're going to review and ultimately approve the research. So the first category is exempt, and those studies, as we just talked about, don't pose any more than greater than minimal risk to participants. But they also have to meet certain design criteria. For example, they have to use things like secondary data if you're pulling archival records of some sort. Perhaps it's pedagogical research done about teaching and in the classroom. And importantly, your subjects are not identifiable. So that kind of first order, that exempt status, requires those two things to go hand in hand. One, that you are not posing more than minimal risk. And then two, you have these kind of structures of the way that the research is set up. The second category is limited or expedited. Still, in this case, cannot involve more than minimal risk. That's this really important delineation point. But they don't meet the structural or design criteria that the exempt status studies do, okay? Importantly, for both exempt and limited, we cannot include vulnerable populations. That is folks that are incarcerated, pregnant, or people that are under the age of 18, minors, right? There's some other vulnerable populations that we can consider, people that are marginalized in some way or have other risk associated with them by being identified as part of a study. And then finally, full review by the Human Subjects Committee is reserved for studies that may have more than minimal risk, right? It's something that we're concerned about that may extend beyond that sort of just what could happen in your daily life. Even in that case, the risks have to be appropriately mitigated. And then this type of study is automatically required if there are any vulnerable populations at all involved in them. So the kinds of questions that we get pretty regularly is how long will the approval take? And that is really contingent on this issue of the pathway that it's going to go past, right? So if you have a study with a lot of risk associated with it, or you're using vulnerable populations, it's going to be a little bit longer than the limited reviews. We anticipate roughly about 2 weeks for an expedited review, but it could be closer to more like a month for a full board review. And that's because those reviews are done at our full committee meetings, which do happen twice a month, but the protocol has to be received, reviewed by the committee, and then met and discussed. So, the other questions we get asked are about what types of revisions will people be expected to provide. And this is really, it's dependent on sort of what you have provided us with. We have some studies that we give back very few requests, if any, for revisions because either the person has been regularly submitting to the Human Subjects Committee and they've got down what we're looking for. In some cases, they met with us prior to submitting to ask questions and clarifications about what we needed. But oftentimes we've got a lot, and that back and forth of us asking you for revisions, you giving them back to us, and kind of going back and forth is oftentimes what can really extend the approval process out longer than these expected timeframes. And then the last question that we get all the time, I'll get emails, right, with offhanded comments about general information about a study and just saying, so this is exempt, right? And it's really important that that is not sort of like an offhanded determination that I or anybody on the committee can make. We do have some tools, and I want to talk kind of further about this because studies that are exempt, there's a way for us to figure this out, right? We just have to make sure that you have all the information, you've thought about all of the pieces of this. And so we'll kind of talk a little bit about what we're doing there. So if something is considered exempt, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is not subject to any type of oversight. So exempt just means you are doing research, it's less than minimal risk, and that you have adhered still to all of the expectations in our policies and procedures manual for good research. For example, you still have to provide participants with a consent form. So we, however, have developed a new tool that assists investigators in self-determining and reporting the fact that they're doing that exempt research. So this is automated, it's through a Google form. You will go in, you will share the information about your study, if you believe it to be exempt, and it kind of clearly walks you through this sort of guidelines and expectations around that. And it becomes quite evident, I think, to you as a researcher, if that is not the case, if the study is not exempt, in which case it would say to you, hey, this is likely not going to qualify. You need to go down this other pathway. I suppose there's a possibility, right, that somebody could submit an exempt study through this tool and either overlook pieces or not share with us correctly how that happens. And should that come to light, so let's say the committee is made aware that you are doing research and don't use consent forms, something like that. We can reserve the right to withdraw your approval as something being exempt should those types of things come into play, even if we didn't do that like that full screening through either the limited or the full committee process. So just be aware of that. If you have any concerns, or if you go through this tool and it feels like something's in the gray area, there's nothing wrong with you just submitting through the normal channels. We will be happy to tell you once we have, as a committee, reviewed that if something is indeed exempt.
All right, and speaking of exempt, this is where I'm going to help pick up and carry forward some of these ideas. So what I find helpful here is actually to start with how I got involved in the Human Subjects Committee. I'm a second-year faculty member, and my first experiences were all on the end of submitting my own protocols and submitting student protocols and helping be a faculty advisor on projects that were independent studies and also part of our research methods course. So that meant that, a lot of my experiences came from being on the other side before joining this side. And so we thought it really good to kind of see the culmination of some of these ideas related to risk, exempt designs, and the review process by talking about classroom projects, because that's where many of us spend a lot of time looking over the HSC protocols, having to explain to others what risk means, having to guide younger, greener, very excited researchers into how to talk about risk, how to mitigate risk, and how to make choices. So I think the first part to start with is hopefully some encouragement that there are a lot of times where you may be doing something in your class, like having your students go and ask 5 friends what their favorite color is, as part of like a quick little sampling, exercise as part of your lecture materials and, participation activities. A lot of little classroom projects, kind of these smaller moments, they don't quite meet the federal definition of research, where it's systematic, answering some sort of question, it wants to be disseminated. So there is a really helpful classroom project checklist available on our website. And I think starting there is even the best place, because it starts to outline, hey, if you're doing this, and this, it's just a classroom project. If you're not able to check all those boxes, it brings forward some ideas that you're going to have to consider. And I think we know, working with our student population, they get really excited about ideas. And so there's some really great ways to acknowledge the times where these ideas that they have are going to be where you need to walk them through the HSC approval process. You need to help them with their protocol forms. You need to help them with their consent language and what they're actually asking participants. Because as Michelle brought up, once they start to ask their friends, like, oh, do you experience any sort of anxiety in the classroom? Or do you, what do you do when you're in a Zoom classroom? What sort of, way do you describe your personality? What sort of experiences have you had, that are risk-taking behavior? All of those sorts of things that they start to get interested in researching and studying. That's when we start to see that there's going to be times that we need to have HSC review be part of you working with your students. So that means that some of these projects, including perhaps classroom projects, are going to be part of the process when they're collecting that sensitive, private, potentially identifiable information, right? Anything that can be tied back to them, as Michelle brought up with records. If there's any chance that your results are going to be disseminated beyond the classroom, I always think those physical classroom walls, but we also know nowadays with the metaphorical classroom walls and virtual walls, if you're going to encourage your students to take their ideas to Quest, that means there is an audience beyond just the classroom learning objectives and people that are going to be paying attention to their research. If you're going to encourage them to submit to undergraduate research conferences, they need to have HSC approval. A lot of students also are interested in working with vulnerable populations. Of course, as we know before, if they're doing research under the guidance of having experts like you part of the process, they can, but that is a risk factor that must be mitigated. So if they want to work with students or children under the age of 18, there are some ways that they can do that, but it is subject to maybe those higher levels of review because of risk. And also, if these are thesis projects or master's thesis, honors thesis, again, that's that dissemination, and also that they are truly doing research, right, from start to finish, involving that systematic inquiry. So those are going to be the times where they're going to have to think about HSC review, which means you're going to have to think about HSC review and guiding them through the resources. So when it comes to these classroom projects, it really just mirrors what we should be doing when we're submitting our own protocols, starting at that beginning of, what is this protocol asking for? How am I describing my procedures? How am I acknowledging the risks that exist? How am I explaining those risks on the consent form? How am I mitigating those risks? So my participants, even if they're fellow students that are just recruited through Facebook message or something, they need to still be treated as human subjects because they are. So that means that one of the first points is always starting with ethical research, right? So making sure that your students complete their city training modules where they'll learn about all this material in depth, just like we do. So those city training modules, we have guides on how they can set up accounts, how they can add the courses, complete the modules, print their certificates for you to be able to collect and review, right? This makes a really good classroom assignment. And this is also something that is helpful for you to do as well, because, you know, we're just giving a quick glimpse into what risk is, a quick glimpse into some of these kind of governing bodies and assumptions of knowledge. So you'll also get that in-depth knowledge when you do your training. We also recommend that you provide some guidance to students. So that means not just, oh, well, you took your city training, you must know everything, but being able to review consent forms with them, right? Being able to talk about risk, being able to talk about how we present information to different audiences, describe populations, describe sampling, and also very important, recruitment. So while they may simply want to message their friends and put something on social media and on Twitter, those are sorts of things that once we're recruiting people, that's part of our protocol where you can describe how they're going to do it, but they can't just get all excited and start sharing links without having someone be involved first to make sure that it meets that checklist of simply being a project, that's a classroom project, and catching those red flags early. So this student project guide, it does have some red flags, and one of those is recruitment, because that's where we're moving beyond those classroom walls in ways that start to get at some of that risk. And the biggest thing here is planning ahead. So we do have, you know, our full meetings on our schedule, but we also have to think that, you know, as you're working with them, hopefully you can address some of the concerns. So if they are suddenly, you know, describing, well, I want to go walk into a prison and sample a bunch of people, face-to-face research, right? There should be some red flags that start to go off like, oh, okay, let's talk about this. How might we channel your excitement and energy for this idea, and maybe start with a couple smaller steps first. So that means, you know, when you are designing your syllabus, like I'm doing right now for our research methods course, making sure that you have these kind of gatekeeper moments in there earlier. So having them submit a copy of the protocol to you, you working through, having, you know, time in class to walk through things. Also making sure that you plan time that they can get their data collected and analyzed. So not kind of brushing up right at that end and saying, oh, well, it says about a week. Okay, well, I'll have them do it like, you know, 2 weeks before the final, and then they'll be collecting their data during like the week before finals, right? We don't want that for them or for us or for you. So this is one that, you know, if there's any possibility for dissemination beyond the classroom, submit it to HSC, right? This is the time where if they come up with something really great, they have some really wonderful findings, and you want to encourage them, or they want to say, hey, I want to like tell people about this. If they don't have that HSC, right, we need to make sure that we're protecting those human subjects, that those human subjects have been adequately informed using an informed consent process, that, you know, we have followed all of the auspices of the guidance, because this goes beyond just us on a campus. This is getting into federal oversight, Belmont rule, all of those fun things. So when it comes to our classroom projects, that may start to bring up some flags in your mind of going, oh no, but right now I'm in a virtual classroom and, you know, it's COVID. Can I do my research? And you may even be thinking that for your own research interests. And I'm here to tell you, like we all are, yes, we've been reviewing and approving protocols. This has been going on, you know, as soon as we moved virtual, these sorts of conversations happen. How can we make sure that we're still protecting our human subjects, making sure that they understand the risks and how we describe those risks? So yes, you can do research under the current times that we live in. So when it comes to talking about your research, we have room in our protocol where you can specify, you know, the location and procedures that you're using. So if this is going to be one that in the past you might have distributed a pen and paper survey, well, good part is you can describe now, hey, I'm doing this online. You know, it's going to be, you know, a link to this Qualtrics form. Here's a copy of the protocol and the informed consent. And if your research is one where those procedures make sense for in-person research, this is where, again, kind of that higher level, right? We're kind of operating under a lot of different influences. Here, we're really guided by state, county, and campus regulations. So for instance, when we went on that pause in the fall, that would have been the time that, you know, if we're not coming to campus and we're not having any face-to-face interaction, if you have a protocol that says you can do face-to-face interviews, well, we need to follow those regulations. So that does make it a little bit You know, we're trying to plan for a little bit of the unknown, but there's ways to think about your procedures, think about those human subjects, thinking about their risk and how you're going to mitigate it as you're designing things. So when it comes to doing research during COVID, especially if there's an in-person component, if you have people coming to your office to do interviews or fill something out, we have to acknowledge those COVID risks, and both in the consent and your protocol, because that is a risk, right? So being able to say things about how those risks will be mitigated, that, you know, participants will be asked to wear masks, or participants will be asked to practice social distancing, or only one person will be allowed in the time to reduce density in the room, right? There are ways to address that risk. And if you're thinking about this and you go, oh, well, I have my study approved and I haven't been doing any data collection because it was approved for face-to-face, and now I realize maybe there's a way to collect data through other means, or even, you know, address these COVID risks, we do have modification and renewal procedures. So once your research is approved, right, we assume that you're going forward and doing something with it. We do have check-ins, you know, about once a year where we'll reach out and say, hey, are you still doing this research? And you also tell us in the protocol form, when do you think you'll kind of be wrapped up? But if you have things there and you need to make some of these pivots and changes, there are modification and renewal procedures available. So that means that you can say, hey, this is my approved protocol that I have. Here's the number. Here's what it was done. Here's the revised protocol. Here's what I'm going to be doing instead. Here's how I'm going to be addressing that risk. How does that change my recruitment? How does that change, you know, my procedures and, you know, it's sort of the administration part. You're able to tell us, right? So we review that, and that's something that kind of brings up some of the big things that we want to end on, which is making sure, as we saw from the beginning of the presentation, we are your colleagues. We are here to help, and we have a lot of helpful resources available for you. So this is where I'm going to exit out of our slideshow, which is luckily right at the end. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our website. So Laura Spenceley, one of our HSC members, has been bringing some links into the chat while we've been doing this. That is the links that are on the website, and also that were in our slides. So when we're looking at our website, one thing that you'll see is that we have a lot of detail and a lot of information. So again, this was where I was able to start working with HSC, and I found it very user-friendly on being on kind of the other side, and I still find it very user-friendly. So we have all these little tab areas, and where I'm going to start is recognizing, you know, we have our policies and procedures manual that was dropped in the chat that details everything in extensive levels. So I do recommend looking through it. I do a lot of Control F and find what I'm looking for. But we have the procedures here of how to submit a new protocol. We have them both in a Google Doc and a Word form for people to fill out. We have sample documents to help you prepare and envision what your informed consent will look like. We have a submission link. And then we even have a visual that kind of describes what that review process will look like. We have information about city training here. We have a training guidance document. That link was in the chat, how to create an account. And then this is this lovely section that I was most drawn to at first, which is all about classroom projects involving human participants and human subjects. So we do have a little flow chart to help you here, a good little visual, and then this policy document that's very helpful that gives you, if it meets these criteria, it's classroom project. If it starts to involve these red flags, you need HSC approval. So I found this section really helpful, and then some details out about, you know, where that distinction is between classroom project and systematic study and inquiry that moves into research. We also have some other resources under here that are covered a lot in the city training, but if you need a quick link to them, they are all here. I'm talking about the revised common rule, talking about the Belmont report, talking about federal regulations, right? A riveting reading. And over here, as we talked about, we have, if your research is exempt, we have a link to that form already here for you. And renewal and modification. We do have that form link that was dropped in the chat, also available here. And one thing that's important to kind of end with, as we talk about some things, right? When you're looking at information, as Teo brought up, that HSC admin at Oswego email that goes, you know, it is set up to be permanent while we may have new chairs right? And we may have transitions in leadership. That's the account that always goes. And right now, Teo is the one that will be, responding, disseminating information, sharing with us as we need to respond to things. So this is maybe even a good starting point. If you have questions, it's okay to start by asking questions by email and also looking at our meeting schedule. So we are in the process of finalizing those dates, but soon this will be posted. We will be meeting the first week of classes. So if you have your own protocol that you're worried about, right, get it in where we have these meetings set. And I saw that Teo turned on his camera, so maybe he'll be able to, before we hand it over for full Q&A, maybe talk about what that meeting schedule will look like and, anything else. And then we're here to answer any questions that you have, all right, about anything. So Teo, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, they are finalized. So we did hear back from the last member because we want to make sure that everybody can be there, at least in theory. So we'll be meeting Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Starting the first week of classes, and then potentially every other week thereafter. So we'll post that schedule pretty shortly, but we try to meet every other week so that we can make sure that if someone has a full review required, we can get that turned around pretty quick for them too.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we're, there's, we won't look at the full membership, but we comprise all areas on campus. And so trying to figure out scheduling for this is, a little bit of, an adventure. So, thanks again, Teo, for making sure that we have that. And I know that we have some people in attendance that, may have some specific questions. This is that time for you to ask those questions. You have 4 people here that, we're all willing to help. But, this is where what we've found is being able to ask some of those questions can also help you prepare your protocol. This is a good time for general questions, but instead of kind of viewing it as like, oh, I send it to this email and I don't know what happens, it's okay to start some of the conversations as you're working on things. It's okay to look over these materials again and say, oh, wait, I'm trying to remember risk. How would I talk about this, right? But we are all here to answer your questions.
I want to just add one thing, and Andrew, maybe we could stop the share so that way, in case anybody has any questions, we can see them. But I think while we talked about sort of a lot of general cases, that there's a lot of similarities. One thing we recognize is that everybody across campus does all different types of research, and we are oftentimes presented with really specific circumstances that maybe we haven't encountered before as a committee. And I think that the other thing that you'll find from us is that even if we don't know the answer, we are all, I think, interested enough in this topic and willing to find out what the right approach is and to help you with that. So no matter how unique or how kind of out of the box your research question or design may be, I think that we are all interested in helping you support that and solve those issues. We've run into some really interesting projects over the last couple of years, and as we identify those, and sometimes we're reaching out to colleagues outside of Oswego just to kind of see what best practices have been in those areas as well.
Yeah, Michelle, thank you for your comment in the chat. This is kind of designed as basics, a little bit of demystifying the process. And we have this recording. We also have a recording from fall when we have also done this. So we have multiple resources available. And yeah, that's the thing, we are your colleagues on campus. We all care about research success that helps you and helps students and helps us, right? In the case that I also to submit my own protocols. And, it's a bit of an overwhelming thing if you think, oh, there's all these federal regulations and state regulations and, kind of big picture things. But at the end of the day, what we care about is your success in making sure that our human subjects are protected. So.
I guess the last thing that I will say, and then we can probably wrap up, is that we are actively in the process of creating more resources, more samples, additional kinds of things to have on our website. So if there's something that any of you aren't seeing there that would be helpful to you, if you have something that you regularly run into with your students or something that would be helpful to share, we are really interested in that feedback as well. All right, I think with that, we can wrap up for today. Thank you all for joining us, and we appreciate your interest in the Human Subjects Committee, and we look forward to hearing from you and learning about your protocols and the research that you're doing in the upcoming semester.